Khazir absently scratched beneath his beak, muttering a quiet curse. His feathered crest had begun drooping a week prior, and now lay nearly flat against his neck. His partner, equally weary, approached from the group of officers near the crime scene tape, his tentacles hanging loosely from his chin. "Third this week, Xylax, and still no leads," he said. Xylax nodded solemnly. "The department leadership is divided on this matter. Some believe the deaths are too targeted to be the work of wild creatures. Yet these incidents match nothing we've encountered before. They've called in a human consultant to assist." These cases had puzzled the detectives on the newest colony planet, Zethia, for the past 2 months. The victims shared enough similarities that the department was confident a serial offender was responsible, though the perpetrator's identity remained elusive. All had been killed in the same manner. Small holes drilled into their heads, the opposite sides seemingly exploded, resulting in instant, if gruesome, deaths. There were no signs of plasma scorches or laser burns, and the splatter patterns indicated the damage came from outside the victims' heads. "What sort of consultant?" Khazir inquired. Xylax shrugged. "A human. They may suspect a Terran creature is responsible. As I understand, that planet hosts numerous species, capable of easily killing any sapient in this colony, some even kept as pets." Khazir shook his head as if to conceal the shiver down his spine. Humans had been trouble ever since they joined the Galactic community. First contact had gone poorly for them. After leaving their home system, they had encountered the Livern, Xylax's people, who had established a new colony nearby. The Livern had not realized the human explorers were not native and had collected them for study, an action the humans had interpreted as a declaration of war. Being technologically behind, the humans were unable to make headway in space combat. But tales of their soldiers on the ground had terrified even the most veteran warriors. Entire military bases were torn apart by small squads of humans, and the advanced recon team sent to Earth had only time to send a single report on the highly competitive predatory food chain before becoming prey themselves. Earth had been labeled a death world, and the Livern sued for peace. Since then, tensions had remained high as the Galactic community tried to make amends with the apex predators. This colony had been opened to the humans, though they had declined in favor of starting their own. Evidently, hard feelings lingered. A nearby shuttle touching down pulled Khazir from his thoughts. Most of the department approached the shuttle, eager to glimpse the human consultant without appearing too interested. None of them had ever seen a human. As the shuttle doors opened, the human stepped out. It moved on 2 sturdy legs, with 2 similarly thick arms swinging at its sides, ending in small digits that flexed inward as the human composed itself. As it disembarked, the entire craft rocked upward from its suspension, and the human sank into the soil. It looked down at its feet and muttered something muffled behind its mask. Dozens of heads turned to avoid eye contact as it looked up. If the human noticed, it took no notice. Instead, it immediately strolled to the crime scene, a liaison officer trailing behind. The human's long stride forced the poor officer to jog to keep up. It leaned down to examine the deceased recruiting director. It reached with a gentle arm and closed a few fingers around the victim's head, turning it to look at the other side. Khazir struggled to suppress a gulp as he imagined the power in that grip. He nudged Xylax and nodded toward the human. "Let's go." Xylax twitched his tentacles nervously, an understandable reaction, really, but fell in behind Xur all the same. The human stood back up to its full height, nearly twice as tall as Khazir, and had begun examining the wall behind the victim as the detectives approached. "Greetings, human. I am Khazir, one of the detectives on this case. I understand you have knowledge that might help us." The human barely glanced back at him before returning to examining the wall. Then it ducked under the police tape and began walking around the building, liaison in tow. Khazir followed tentatively behind. As he rounded the corner, he saw the human collect a small fragment from the floor on the other side of the wall. It approached this side of the wall, crouching low, and began to press its face nearly against the surface. Khazir felt his impatience come over him. "Would you please share your information, human? We have had 5 of these mysterious deaths this month." The human stood again and turned toward him, eliciting a gulp from Xylax. It approached the pair and held out its arm, digits down. "All of your crime scenes turn up one of these?" Its voice was deep and resonant, though muffled by its mask. It opened its digits, depositing a small coppery stinger into the pocket created by Khazur's wing. "What is this? Some kind of tooth or stinger or something? Is an Earth creature behind this?" The human chuckled. "You could say that. That, Detective Khazur, is a bullet. A stinger is a pretty good analogy, though. Look here." The human led Khazur to the wall and gestured towards a tiny aperture. Khazur peered through the opening, as the human had. Through it, he could observe the crime scene outside, the buildings and alley across the street, and the countryside beyond. "What is a bullet?" Khazur inquired. The human glanced back and forth between Xilax and Khazur for a moment. "You're unfamiliar with bullets?" Xilax offered his trademark shrug as Khazur shook his head. "Is it from some beast? We've heard Earth's creatures are horrifically dangerous." "No," the human replied, shaking their head. "It's more of a tool. It's a projectile launched from a weapon. This one is fairly small, a low-caliber round, likely a civilian rifle designed for hunting small game. No offense," they added hastily. "I'm still lost. A human tool did this?" Khazur asked, perplexed. "A gun, yes. It fires that stinger at high speed. Looks like the shooter fired from the hill there. Hit this lady? The bullet still had enough speed to penetrate the wall and ended up here. This flooring is soft enough to preserve the bullet fairly well. I'll have a ballistics unit check it out. They specialize in bullet crimes," the human explained, addressing the confused silence. Khazur retreated from the wall and glanced at Xilax, who had turned a shade paler. "Civilian?" Xilax eventually stammered. "Sure. Military weapons fire much faster rounds. Bigger, too. If your victim had been hit by a military-grade rifle, well, you probably wouldn't have a body left. Just a new mural on this wall." "Projectile? Is that like a plasma bolt?" Khazur asked, grasping for a familiar concept. "Very much. The difference is it's a physical item and not energy or plasma. It harnesses the chemical power of an accelerant, a small explosive, to push that bullet out of a barrel at a target. There's a huge variety of bullet sizes, shapes, accelerant mixtures, and so on. We know the bullet size, and based on the damage done to the deceased and the wall behind, we can guess the powder used." "You make it sound like a human with a weapon of such destruction is a good thing," Xilax exclaimed, uncharacteristically emotional. The human paused for a moment, then chuckled. "Mass destruction? No. This type of weapon is at the lower end of human lethality. It likely couldn't kill a person beyond point-blank range. We have melee armaments more dangerous than this rifle. However, this is good news. We know the killer is human, we know the weapon type, so we can find him more easily, and we know his location. We just need a motive, and we should be able to track this individual down. We'll solve this, Khazur." Khazur and Xilax exchanged a glance. "We have a motive," they said. Khazur scratched beneath his beak as he reviewed the ballistics report the human had provided. It shed more shadows than light on the investigation. "I thought you understood the weapon type, human?" Khazur regarded them inquisitively, but Xilax nodded along, evidently aware of fingerprints. The investigator continued. "I was hoping there would be traces of whatever special powder they used on the back of the bullet. If there was, it was contaminated. They came up with blood, bone, and some kind of mud. I assume you use local resources for that plaster you build with?" "Yes," Xilax replied. "We use a plaster formed from the soil here. It's easy to shape and lightweight. The permanent structures are built from resources traded for with your human settlement, though. They're built on long stilts to reach bedrock, since the weight causes them to sink into the ground. It's caused a couple tremors around here. Our colony architect was supposed to look into it, but..." The investigator bowed their head for a moment. "He was the first victim, right?" "And a friend," Xilax said, his tentacles coiling angrily for a moment. "Did his scene look about the same?" The investigator inquired, pulling out a notepad. The human detective nodded, freeing their foot from the earth once more. They reached the first scene in relative silence, each investigator considering their theories before voicing them. The location had been thoroughly documented at the time, but had since been cleaned. A small bouquet of flowers and a picture of the former architect were all that remained of the incident. The site itself was fairly remote. The architect, Rigby, had evidently been looking into the tremors around the building on the edge of the colony which had brought him to the backside of the Ansible station, the colony's primary communication structure and one of the first built with human construction. The Ansible was heavy and highly temperamental, requiring a permanent structure. Xylax approached the wall, closely examining it and running several of his tentacles and hands across the surface, while the human detective turned their back to the scene, surveying the landscape. Khazir began to scour the ground, more to appear helpful than in hopes of finding something. Xylax spoke first. "A small crater here, not all the way through. Feels like a cluster of small fragments hit this spot." The human nodded. The bullet likely broke apart inside the victim, and the portion that made it through shattered against that wall. "Now that you mention it," Xylax responded, "there were some foreign metal pieces found in the autopsy. Do you think the projectile broke apart inside Rigby?" "Perhaps. I don't mean to be insensitive, but is your skeletal structure denser than Khazir's? I assume your people, Khazir, have hollow bones to facilitate flight? And Xylax, your people seem to have a more substantial build." "Yes, human," Khazir said, "though my people cannot fly on this planet, as the atmosphere is too thin. And Xylax's people have no true skeletons, only a cartilage spine of sorts. The rest is muscle, water, and organs." Bigsby was a denser target than the latest victim, and he stood against a solid wall. "I doubt we'll recover enough of the bullet for the ballistics team to work with. I can see the same hill from here. It's much farther away, beyond what I would have guessed, but it's the only spot that could have observed both scenes." Xylax shrugged. "The human might have moved," he suggested. The human shook its head and pointed back the way they came. A stark trail of deep footprints led back to it. "You'd have seen evidence of that. I'm going to check out that hill anyway, just to be sure. You two coming?" Khazir began the march toward the far hill eagerly. Behind him, he heard Xylax grumbling. Xylax wasn't much of a hiker. Khazir and the human soon found themselves at the base of the hill, waiting patiently for Xylax. He caught up, panting, and dabbed a sleeve at his glistening forehead. "I'm getting too old for this," he heaved. "I could," the human hesitated a moment. "I could carry you?" Xylax dismissed the offer with a wave of a tentacle. "Lead on, I'll catch up." The human turned to begin up the hill but was waylaid at the first step. Its leg, all the way up to its hip, sank into the soft terrain. The human's attempts to extract itself saw its arms disappear up to its elbows as well. Eventually, by laying flat to spread out its weight and rolling, it was able to free his leg, the dirt crumbling back into the hole it had made. "This could be a problem," it said. "I'll go up this way," Khazir said. "You should try the far side of the hill. I think there is some stone on that side. We'll meet back here with Xylax when we're done." The human accepted the proposal and began walking gingerly along the base of the hill. Xylax nodded uncharacteristically enthusiastically and sat down heavily at the base of the hill. "I worry the human may harm you," he said over his shoulder. "Not much I'd be able to do about it anyway." "What? Why do you say that?" Xylax shrugged again. "Because it's huge and strong." "No. Why would you think the human would harm me?" Khazir asked. "I don't know this human. All I do know is that humans can be incredibly vicious, and this human sure knows a lot about these stingers and the supposed user. Maybe it's the killer and it's trying to remove the detectives working on the case." Khazir opened his beak, but then closed it without a word. The human had said it was likely not the place where the user fired the stinger, but it wanted to come out here anyway, far from the rest of the colony. "Has the human mentioned any suspects?" Khazir asked Xylax. Xylax shrugged again. "It hasn't said anything about checking the human colony yet either." Khazir scratched his chin thoughtfully before a voice made him jump. "This ain't it," the human said, descending the hill in big steps that left deep furrows in the dirt. "The ground is soft enough up there any human would have left some kind of trap." It broke off as its leg plunged into another pit further aside the first. "Human," Khazir called cautiously, "have you looked into any of the members of your colony yet?" "Not yet," it grunted, freeing its leg again. "Got a suspect?" Xylax looked to Khazir. "We believe we have a theory." Khazir scratched nervously under his beak. No doubt a bald spot had formed amidst his feathers there over the last month. Xylax had just expressed his doubt about the human's intentions, just as it had shown back up, catching the pair in the midst of their theorizing. out of town and away from help. Vulnerable. "We were wondering," Xur began diplomatically. "Did you kill these people?" Xylax demanded. He was still sweating and winded from walking to the hill. His tentacled anatomy made long-distance travel difficult out of water, but there had been 5 victims already, and Xylax wasn't going to let a lead go in the investigation of their murder. However, the human had stated that the lead was not found here. Xur flinched as the human stood back up, nearly double the size of him and his partner. Through conscious effort, he kept his wings from flapping in a natural flight response. They wouldn't have done him any good in this thin atmosphere anyway, and he was confident the human could catch him and Xylax in seconds, even if they tried to flee. "Am I a suspect?" it muttered. "Why haven't you looked into the human colony yet?" Xylax pressed. The human lifted its hands, digits opened wide, and Xur was sure it was going to lunge at them. Instead, the human seemed to make a placating gesture as it said, "I'm going to. I couldn't risk running a full investigation right away. It could scare the suspect underground." The ground sank away beneath its feet again, and the human chuckled dryly at the irony. "Is this hill hollow or something?" Xylax did not let the subject change. "A human weapon is responsible for 5 deaths, and a human colony lies only not 200 miles from here. Why hasn't there been an investigation?" "I need definitive proof before I can dig around there," the human grunted, withdrawing another leg from the hole. "I don't know how your legal system works, but I have to prove beyond doubt who did it to make the criminal pay. If there's any doubt at all, any way for the perpetrator to weasel out of it, sneak out of it, they'll get away. I was hoping for more definitive proof so that I can lock in on the right suspect, but I've got nothing else here." "So we'll go to the human colony?" Xur asked. "Well," the human looked down for a moment, "I was hoping you'd come with me, Xur, as the detective in charge of the case. Xylax." It trailed off. Xylax nodded. "I wouldn't want to walk into the Latmas burrow anyway." Twin tufts of hair above the human's eyes rose and it cocked its head. "Latmas burrow?" it muttered to itself. "You mean amidst predators?" Xylax crossed his tentacles in front of him, a posture of indignation amongst his people. "So now you'll go?" "Don't have much choice left. Now that I've caught you." The human's shoulders moved up and down in quick, short movements as a staccato of sound came from its mouth, and its voice responded with mirth. "No trust, huh? What would it take to prove myself to you?" "Your weapon," Xylax said. The human shook his head and withdrew an L-shaped piece of metal from a holster on its hip. It pressed a button, and a piece slid from the handle. He offered the detached piece to Xylax. "These are the bullets I have. They're shorter, thicker, and more rounded, and they don't travel as far, but they pack a decent punch. If I had used them on your victims, they would have been mostly reduced to pulp, and I'd have to have been standing right in your town to do it too." Xylax was unfazed. "So you have 2 different types of bullets. Just because you show me these doesn't mean you didn't use the others before." "That's not how guns work," the human sighed. "But if it helps earn your trust, I'll leave this with you when I go to the human colony. Just don't point this part." They touched a finger to the side of the weapon, away from the handle. "At anything you don't want destroyed. I mean it. Point it at the ground and don't look down the barrel under any circumstances, or you could end up like the latest victim." The human let out a short whistle that came out awkwardly low through its mask, and the shuttle immediately began to shake. The first to depart was the pilot, running madly away from the shuttle. A moment later, and Xur understood why. A 4-legged creature emerged in a blur of black and brown fur, rushing towards the human. Xur's instincts were untamable, as his wings beat the air frantically. Unable to take to the skies, Xur quickly took shelter behind the human. Krax, as the human referred to it, moved faster than any animal Xur had ever seen. It covered the distance from the shuttle to the human in under 3 seconds, skidding to a stop at the human's feet and digging small trenches in the process. Resting on its hind legs, its tail flicked back and forth as its long snout and pointed ears focused intently on the human. A long tongue hung limply from its mouth, and Xur gulped at the sight of its sharp teeth. "This is Krax," the human said. "He's friendly right now, but can be very focused when needed." "What is he?" Xur asked. "He's a dog, a common pet for humans. Krax has been trained as a police dog, so he can help keep you safe. If there's trouble, you can have him go after any troublemakers. I was just informing Zur that Krax can watch over you and help ensure your safety. If the killer does come into town, Krax can catch them unawares at the police station entrance. Simply point at the door and say, "Guard," when you're inside, and he'll handle the rest. Is Krax more dangerous than the weapon? Xylax asked, holding the human's weapon carefully pointed downward. Well, to you, I suppose so. Let's just say they are equally formidable and deserving of your respect. Though I'd prefer if you didn't send my dog out to be shot by a gun. Xylax glanced sideways at the dog, which seemed to be panting happily beside him. Very well. As you say, human. The human nodded, told Krax to stay, and then headed for the shuttle. Can you fly it, Khazir? It seems our pilot is missing. The human colony was just under 180 miles away, but the shuttle covered the distance in an hour and a half. Khazir looked out the viewport to see a settlement composed entirely of large buildings made from human materials. Some rested solidly on the ground, while a few were still higher on their stilts, slowly sinking. In the center of the colony was a vast hole that spiraled down out of sight. The landing pad was ringed with gently pulsing lights, and the shuttle's automated landing sequence took over, so Khazir joined the human in the hold. A quick overview, the human said as he entered. This is a mining colony. Zethia's light gravity made it easy to land heavy equipment, and the soft soil made it even easier to dig down to harder stone. There's a substantial deposit of palladium deep underground. Don't ask me for more details, that's all I know. It's made the colony fairly prosperous, but it's still a small one since the planet can't sustain large-scale human habitation. I called ahead, and the mayor is going to meet with us. His office is quite close. I don't actually have an office of my own here, as I cover a few colonies and work out of my shuttle. We can head there afterwards. Khazir nodded along and opened his notebook. He was nervous and felt incredibly out of his element, but he had a job to do, and if he focused on it enough, perhaps he could forget that he was walking into the Latmus's burrow. The shuttle doors opened, and the ground-level view lent the human buildings a fresh sense of scale. Humans moved about, and Xur was surprised by their diversity, varying in color, fur coverage, mostly on their heads, and stature from around Xur's size up to a head taller than the human detective. Most hurried by, absorbed in their tasks, but a few small ones noticed them and pointed at Xur. Xur tried to puff up his crest and project authority, but sensed these young humans would be more captivated by his feathers than his bearing. As the human stepped off the shuttle, the rocking motion nearly unbalanced Khazir, prompting laughter from some of the small humans. Khazir quickly followed the human, head bowed. The human offices resembled the one Khazir had visited before. They met a receptionist in the mostly empty ground floor, who directed them to an elevator leading to another reception area. Soon, a secretary ushered them through double doors, and within 10 minutes of landing, Khazir sat before the human mayor. The mayor was more wrinkled than the detective, lacking the fur atop his head but with a thin layer around his jaw. He and the detective clasped hands in greeting, conversing amicably. Khazir glanced around the room, 2 chairs before a large desk, some extra chairs by a shorter table, and cabinets with labeled drawers along one wall. Behind the mayor were personal mementos, family photos, a long wooden and metal plank, a certificate, and a framed key labeled Novo Crixia. Khazir's gaze returned to one of the pictures, which showed the mayor and 2 smaller humans resembling him holding similar planks, with 3 deceased creatures resembling Xur, but with bald heads and darker feathers in front of them. Inwardly, Xur swallowed hard, then discreetly snapped a picture of the wall with his notepad. The action caught the attention of the 2 individuals. Observing something of interest? The mayor inquired. Oh, Khazir stammered. I was simply fascinated by the decorations. The mayor nodded and smiled. Those were made by my son, he said, gesturing to the picture. Zerk and Jake. That was the first time young Jake accompanied us on a hunt. He was so eager to bag his first turkey. His eyes gleamed for a moment, but he glanced down at Xur and quickly moved to take the photo down. Forgive me, that image may be insensitive. I apologize if I caused you any discomfort. Khazir shook his head. It's quite all right, human. I understand there are many non-sapient creatures that resemble me. I apologize for my bluntness, but are you aware we are investigating several murders? Yes, the mayor nodded. I was pleased that Detective Harnan has been able to assist. Is that the reason for your visit? Afraid so, Harnan replied. Xur blinked for a moment, realizing he had never asked the human's name. The murder weapon is a firearm, and it seems the Xeno colony does not possess such devices. The mayor's expression grew somber as he sat behind his desk, steepling his fingers. You suspect the killer is human. Most likely. It's possible it's not, but a human would have had to provide the killer with a weapon either way. How many firearms does New Jameson have? I don't suppose you've heard any anti-Xeno sentiments either. I cannot say that I have, the mayor said. We do maintain an armory here for defense purposes, a handful of assault rifles, one machine gun, and one anti-vehicle shoulder-launched missile, all securely stored in the basement of this building. I take it you would like to inspect them? Harnan nodded. And civilian weapons? None. The colony is owned by a mining corporation, and they have set strict civic rules. No firearms are permitted. There is little room for them on our ships as well. And that one? Harnan inquired, gesturing to the plank. I brought this as a memento, the mayor said as he retrieved the long plank from the wall, but it had to be deactivated per the regulations. Harnan accepted the plank, sliding a piece on top back and forth and noting a hole drilled about halfway along it. He nodded and handed it back, seemingly satisfied. We'll need to see the others, please. The three returned to the elevators and descended to the basement. The mayor continued the conversation. All our citizens are workers here, and all our workers are accounted for during business hours. Unless all these deaths happened on a weekend, it couldn't have been one of my people. Nobody called out sick one day? Khazir asked. The mayor shook his head. Only one. Grenth, and trust me, he couldn't have done it. He's been in the infirmary for over a month now. Grenth's the reason we found out about the composition of the soil. Harnan frowned down at Khazir, who shrugged back. What do you mean the composition of the soil? He asked. Oh, Dr. Jung would be able to explain it better than me. Seems the soil has a lot of air in it, and some of it is pretty volatile. Grenth found a big pocket of it with his drill, knocked all his teeth out, and did a number on the rest of him. Been in the infirmary for about 6 weeks. He's recovering, but he's still not very mobile. Infirmary's by the top of the mine. Big white building, if you want to check it out. Harnan nodded and proceeded into the weapons room they arrived at. He examined the weapons there, a task more suited for him than for Khazir, and took a few notes. He nodded finally and said, Okay. The mayor escorted them back to the lobby and said his farewells as he turned to depart. Harnan asked one more question. Just being thorough here, but who has access to that room? The mayor frowned for a moment. Just me, the site foreman, and the overnight foreman, I think. Who maintains them? I do. Used to be in the Marines, so cleaning a rifle is like therapy to me. My sons help when they aren't in school, but the weapons never leave that room and my boys never go in without me. Harnan nodded again. Thanks. He led Khazir outside and away from prying ears before whispering to him. I'm at a loss here. The weapons in the bunker don't match the one that killed your victims, and the one in the mayor's office looks pretty unusable to me. Someone must have either made a new one or snuck one here somehow. All I can think of now is to check this Grenth guy out. The mayor's kids should be in school during the murders, but we'll stop by there and see if one of them played hooky. Outside of that, I'm out of suspects. Xur nodded. I sense something peculiar about that mayor. Do you suspect he's concealing information? Undoubtedly, Harnan confirmed. His expression betrays him. I don't comprehend that reference, Xur said, scratching under his beak. Khazir scratched beneath his beak, a gesture that had become a ritual-like habit when deep in contemplation. The details of the several murders in his small colony on the remote planet had puzzled him and his partner for nearly 6 weeks now. The crime scenes all appeared similar. A member of the colonization board, deceased with a disturbing head wound, found near the colony's outskirts. It wasn't until the human detective, Harnan, had joined the search that a few more clues had surfaced. One such clue was the small projectile Khazir now held in the fold of his wing. The human had referred to it as a bullet, a physical projectile capable of fatal wounds from medium distances. Khazir and Harnan had come to the human colony seeking the proverbial and perhaps literal smoking gun, as Harnan had described it. The investigation had uncovered new leads, but not the answers they had hoped for. The only tool capable of firing this particular projectile had been intentionally sabotaged to be unusable before being brought to this planet. All the other tools, or guns as Khazir had learned they were called, were designed to fire slightly larger projectiles at faster speeds. Had they been the murder weapons, Harnan had assured him, the victims' bodies would have been in much worse condition. Khazir's notebook was filled with scribbled questions, and he struggled to answer even one as he followed Harnan through the human colony to the hospital, where the only outspoken xenophobe lay injured and apparently incapable of committing the crimes. The door slid open quietly, and Khazir glanced up from his pad to take in the new building. While the structure was fairly large, it was incredibly quiet. A receptionist sat behind a desk, pretending to be occupied with official-looking forms, while a pair of double doors flanked her. One was labeled emergency and the other long-term care. The secretary looked up, set aside the paperwork she had likely been doodling on, and greeted them warmly. "How may I assist you, sirs?" she amended, spotting Khazir behind the human detective's legs. "This is Detective Khazir," the human spoke up, "and I'm Detective Harnan. We're here about an injured patient, a man named Grenth." "Oh," the secretary chirped, clicking at her computer before returning to them with an overly emotive expression. "I'm afraid Grenth is still unconscious. The doctor has him on a sedative to manage the pain, as we have limited pain medication available out here." "Is the doctor around?" Khazir asked. "Let me check," she replied, picking up a small phone by her computer. After 3 rings, it was answered. "Dr. Lang, there are a few detectives here to see you." "Mm-hmm. Okay, would you like me to send them in now?" "I'm sure you were." "All right, I'll let them know." She returned the phone to its cradle and smiled up at them. "Dr. Lang is currently in his office, which is the 3rd door on your left, down that corridor," she said, gesturing over her shoulder. "And he wanted me to tell you that you've disrupted his concentration." Harnan led the way through the double doors, the hallway stark and sterile, with clean, shiny floors and small stripes of color, branching off into different doors and passages. Unused was the word that came to mind. Muffled sounds of discussion could be heard from behind the 3rd door on the left, though the tone seemed casual. Harnan reached the door first, waiting a moment for Khazir to catch up before knocking twice and entering without waiting for a response. The room felt reminiscent of the mayor's office, a simple desk and chairs, filing cabinets, a wall with photos and a framed degree. The difference was the black and white checkered pattern projected down from the ceiling, with rows of black and white statues facing one another. The tallest of the statues came about even with Khazir, but only slightly shorter than waist height on the human standing behind it. "Dr. Kylax?" Harnan inquired. "I'm here for a matter of business." Yeah, Dr. Kylax made a dismissive gesture. "Your business distracted me and caused me to be preoccupied." "Whatever," another human, Laura, smirked. "You were at a disadvantage even before you made that move. As Harnan is my witness, Laura, I will beat you next time," Dr. Kylax declared. Laura rolled her eyes, but a competitive smile took hold. "That's great, Dr. Lang," Khazir finally spoke up. "We're certainly supporting you. Of course, if you could spare just 10 minutes to help me solve 6 murders that have traumatized an entire colony, I'd really appreciate it. I'm sure your opponent will understand." Dr. Kylax blinked a few times and looked down at Khazir, evidently seeing him for the first time. His mouth opened and closed a few times, but no words came out. "How can we help?" Laura eventually supplied. "Grenth. What happened to him?" Harnan cut right to the chase. "He hit a pocket of seismic crystals and launched himself skyward. Most of the damage was done by his own equipment hitting him," Dr. Kylax replied almost automatically. "What are seismic crystals?" Khazir asked, scratching beneath his beak. Dr. Kylax looked sheepishly up at his opponent. "Dr. Therix is the geologist here. She'd know better than I." Laura lifted one tuft of fur above one of her eyes as she looked at Dr. Kylax, but the look quickly faded into the same competitive grin she had earlier. She composed herself, though, before answering professionally. Seismic crystals is just what the miners call a new compound that forms naturally on this planet. Chemically, it's mostly potassium, nitrate, and sulfur, much like gunpowder, but it has a few other elements mixed in. It's pretty inert when it's deep in the ground, but pockets of it are present in shallower ground too, where they get access to plenty of oxygen through the loose soil. Just a spark is needed to trigger a sizable reaction. Khazur flipped open his notebook. "Where do seismic crystals form?" he asked. "They're found all over the planet, really. They're generally dispersed throughout the soil, but we've noticed they tend to accumulate in larger clusters beneath hills," Dr. Kylax replied. "It's the thin atmosphere," Khazur remarked, though he suspected the scientists had likely already deduced that fact. "So Grenth hit a pocket with his drill?" Harnan prompted. "Yeah," Dr. Kylax continued. "Probably a fairly sizable chunk. It's more of a concussive blast than a flaming blast, so he didn't get burned very bad. Still, his drill and other tools hit him with force and pretty much pushed him to the surface. The soft, loose soil probably did him a favor and took a lot of force out of his launch. Still, he suffered a fractured jaw, several broken ribs, both clavicles broken, and some slight internal damage. Nothing I couldn't treat, of course, and more bruises than an apple that's been through the dryer. He's been recovering here since then." "When was that?" Khazur asked, checking dates in his notebook. "Maybe 2 months ago? Claire at the front desk would know exactly when." Harnan nodded at Dr. Kylax, then turned to Dr. Therix. "This seismic crystal stuff, you said it's like gunpowder?" "Sort of. More sulfur and less potassium nitrate than traditional gunpowder, I think. But the airy soil still gives the reaction plenty of oxygen. It's got a good push," Dr. Therix explained. "Could it be used in lieu of gunpowder for bullets?" Harnan asked. "I'm not really sure," Dr. Therix shrugged. "You'd need to add an oxidizer, probably if you were taking seismic crystals out of the ground and putting it into a casing. I imagine you could probably mix it with the powder in a normal bullet to give it a bit extra power, though. But bullets aren't really my wheelhouse," she ended apologetically. Dr. Kylax added that Dr. Therix was more focused on battery-related matters. Dr. Therix humbly bowed her head. "It was my scanner that found this deposit of palladium after we missed out on the previous one." A faint memory, like an echo, whispered through Khazur's mind. "What do you mean by missed out on the last one?" Dr. Therix paused briefly. "Well, you know, because of your colony." Khazur shook his head. "I'm not aware of any details about that arrangement." Harnan whispered to Khazur, "Do you know anything about that deal?" Khazur shook his head again. "The mayor didn't mention it when we were with him." "Is there significant geological activity here?" Harnan asked Dr. Therix. She shook her head. "The soil settles pretty easily, and the planet's core, while abnormally active, acts like a giant waterbed. Unless an outside force acts on the ground, it's unlikely to move much." "Even with heavy buildings?" Khazur asked. Dr. Therix replied, "No, those should slide in pretty easily, like sinking through honey." Harnan began furiously writing in his notebook, and Khazur, not wanting to be left out, looked through his as well. The pieces were finally coming together for him. "Would typical mining suffice?" Khazur asked the geologist. "Well, extensive mining tunnels could trigger minor tremors as they eventually collapse. Larger tunnels or mines could likely cause local quakes or landslides," the expert replied. "Thank you, doctors. Your assistance has been most helpful," Harnan said, bowing his head. He swiftly led the way out of the room, with Khazur hurrying to keep up as he hastily tucked his notebook back into his coat. "It's clear now," Harnan whispered excitedly. "Do you recall that ballistics report? It mentioned soil on the bullet. I initially thought it was just from going through that adobe wall and into the ground, but now I suspect our shooter is using this seismic crystals material. It seems it may even provide extra range, but I didn't see any evidence of a human on that hill." Harnan brushed past the secretary without a glance and pushed out into the open air once more. "And the tremors," Khazur interjected. "The geologist said they were likely caused by an external force. There have been no shuttle crashes or meteor impacts in our area for as long as I can remember. I believe someone has been mining the seismic crystals." Harnan paused and thoughtfully tapped his chin. The deceleration was a welcome respite for Khazur as he caught his breath. "Or the palladium," Harnan theorized. All the victims were on the colonization board, right? Perhaps our killer didn't want them investigating the tremors too closely. Or maybe they didn't want your colony to expand further north. Xur looked up at Harnan, his eyes set and his crest rising slightly from its fatigued droop. I suspect we both know who would benefit from that. Harnan nodded solemnly. Get on. Rather than run down the street they came up, Harnan circled the neighboring building and began running along the grass behind the buildings. We don't want him to see us coming, he explained. God damn it, Harnan grimaced. Out for a jog, old-timer, one of them jeered. Shut it, kid, Harnan rumbled, and the feathers on Xur's back stood on end as the aggression from Harnan's tone set off his fight-or-flight response. Harnan examined the object as Xur's notepad chirped with an incoming call. He forwarded it to his earpiece. Detective Xur. Oh, good, you're alive, Xylax's voice came through. We need you back here. Soon, Xylax, Human Harnan and I are on our way to detain a suspect. I think we've got him, Xylax, the human mayor. Did you talk to the human mayor recently? Maybe 20 minutes ago? Why? Xylax sighed. Then it's not him. Xur, we have another victim. Xur scratched beneath his beak as he looked around Harnan's shuttle. The human detective had joined Xur and his partner Xylax in the hunt for a serial killer, plaguing Xur's colony on Zethia. They had suspected the human mayor, but that theory was quickly shut down when another attack occurred while they were gone. The two detectives had hurried to Harnan's ship. Xur wondered about the decision, but did not want to waste time questioning it. He now sat in a fold-out jump seat with an official-looking computer and a large corkboard nearby. Curiously, a bowl of water labeled Cracks sat on the floor, reminding Xur of the frightening creature Harnan had left to help keep the colony safe. Detective Harnan entered the room, interrupting Xur's thoughts. He had donned an additional piece of equipment, a fabric and metal brace around his knee. After falling in a hole while running around the human colony, Harnan had been limping and favoring his other leg. The brace seemed to stabilize his knee and help him maintain balance. Harnan held another item in his hands. I've plotted the course to your colony and set the speed to maximum. It should only take about 30 minutes to get back. Apologies for leaving your shuttle, but I needed to retrieve some things, and we don't have time to go to both shuttles, Harnan explained. Xur nodded. I see you have added a support to your knee. Do humans often augment themselves? Harnan's face flushed slightly, and he chuckled for a moment. Yes, that's just a brace. I had an old knee injury, and that last fall aggravated it, but that's not what I meant. Harnan held up the other item. It was a black fabric that opened like a hinged piece of wood, with the word police written across the front in white lettering. It's armor, Harnan explained as he wrapped it around his chest and secured the open portion at his side. I have another one, but it's definitely too large for you. You could try carrying it, but if a stinger hits it, it'll just hit you, though it may still save your life. Xur considered the offer, understanding the risks of the stingers and the potential benefits of the armor. It can't hurt, I'm sure, he said finally. Harnan nodded and handed him the other piece of armor. As the weight shifted to Xur's wings, he was nearly pulled out of his seat. Though it appeared mostly fabric, the armor weighed a significant portion of Xur's own weight, making it unlikely he would be able to pursue anyone on foot while carrying it. Hopefully, Harnan's knee would not hinder his ability to chase down the perpetrator. What did you observe about those drills? Xur asked Harnan. When they were headed towards the mayor's office, they had been stopped by a hole from a child's drill. Harnan had examined the drill and seemed shocked by something, but they hadn't had time to discuss it yet. They appear capable of reaching speeds up to 90 miles per hour, Harnan said. I'm guessing while they're actually doing the drilling, they probably go about 60. That one had a warning on it, not to go over 30 though, so anything faster might set off seismic crystals. Seismic crystals was the name the humans had given for a naturally occurring substance on this planet that could, if presented with a priming force, cause a decent-sized explosion. When properly contained, seismic crystals could also propel a human stinger straight through a member of the colonization board. Xur nodded again, putting the pieces together. You think the killer used a drill to get back and forth from our colonies? Right. The old drills were decommissioned, so our killer probably got their hands on one and used it to get back and forth. Not only that, but I think they used it to collect the seismic crystals they used to increase their bullet range. Khizr consulted his notebook and looked back at what Dr. Rodriguez had said. The hill. Exactly, Harnan confirmed. Seismic crystals seems to form under hills, and if you'll recall, I fell into a dozen holes on that very hill. I think our shooter was using the drill to mine out seismic crystals from that hill, which left holes behind that I fell in. Not only that, but that must be where they shot from. Harnan shook his head. I didn't see any tracks on top, remember? No, the shooter could have cleared a hideout inside the hill with that drill, Khizr theorized. Harnan smacked his head with the palm of his hand. And that would leave no evidence on top of the hill. But I'm still not sure who we're looking for. What have you got? Khizr looked at his notebook again. His theories had all been debunked pretty thoroughly. Detective Harnan himself had been a suspect at one point, but he had been with Khizr when the last attack happened. A human named Grenth had been known to be less than kind towards members of other species, but he had been hospitalized for the extent of the killing spree. That had left the human mayor, but even though they couldn't confirm his whereabouts when the last attack occurred, there was no way he could have made it from their meeting to Khizr's colony in the short span of time to commit the attack. I don't know yet, Khizr admitted. However, I do have some information on the attack. The victim was Doran, the interim head of the colony board, who was recently attacked. He's the same species as me, a Lariptor, and was hit while escorting some colonists to the police station. Apparently, he was struck more in the shoulder and neck than the head. He's in critical condition, but alive. Harnan asked, Have you got a map? Khizr laid his notebook flat and pulled up a map of the colony and surrounding area. A small red dot on the western side of town marked the site of the last attack. Harnan traced a line from the dot back to the hill, noting it was unobstructed but far. That would be our killer's farthest shot yet. Even with the extra power from seismic crystals, that bullet was probably at the very edge of its range and had lost most of its power, Harnan concluded. An alert sounded from the shuttle's autopilot, informing them they would arrive in a few short minutes. Harnan asked, What's the game plan? You're asking me? Khizr replied. It's your case, Harnan shrugged. Khizr hurried toward the police station, with Harnan keeping pace. The station doors opened silently, but the interior was anything but calm. Worried voices darted back and forth as law enforcement and the colony board debated their options. Crack stood at the door, his hackles raised and teeth bared, barring Khizr's way. Khizr was slightly shorter than eye level with the beast, giving him a clear view of the creature's long, jagged teeth glistening with saliva. He took a step back, nearly colliding with Harnan behind him. Xilax approached the two, maintaining a safe distance from Cracks. Doran is still in critical condition, but the doctors think he'll recover. They also found this stuck inside him, Xilax said, handing Khizr another human stinger. We're going to try to lure the shooter out, Khizr said. I'll borrow the captain's uniform and head to the north end to make myself a target. You and Harnan can move toward the hill, where we think the shooter is hiding. Harnan politely raised his hand. It seems we have not properly introduced ourselves. Xilax nodded before addressing Harnan. Do you approve of this plan? Harnan shrugged. Not particularly, but I do not have a better suggestion. Then I have an alternative proposal. The killer may not be out there at the moment, but it cannot hurt to investigate. Khizr, you and Harnan should check the site, and perhaps take Cracks with you. Xilax glanced at the dog. To see if you can find a burrow. I will remain here and work on the crime scene. You may mock me for being wary of a human with a stinger, but lengthy treks are not my preference. If you truly believe we can lure out the killer, then I suppose I would make the most suitable bait. Harnan said nothing, but took the armor from Khizr's wings and passed it to Xilax with a nod. Feeling its weight and seeing Harnan similarly equipped, Xilax deduced it was armor and began putting it on. His heavier, muscular form was more capable of supporting its weight than Khizr's had been, though it was still cumbersome and large on him. Harnan nodded again and then looked at Cracks. Let us go, we have a killer to apprehend, he said, turning towards the door. Khizr and Harnan had retreated to the human shuttle, and Harnan set the autopilot to fly roughly halfway towards the human colony and then return. Khizr had hoped it would serve as a distraction for the killer, encouraging them to remain underground, but also to feel confident that the detectives were not closing in on their trail. The pair disembarked as the shuttle began to take off and crept stealthily towards the eastern side of the town. The northern and most recently the western sides had been affected by the hill, so the killer must have had a decent vantage point on those sides. As they reached the eastern edge, Harnan crouched and Xur climbed onto his back. He was less than enthusiastic about riding the human here, where his colleagues could see, but Xur understood the practicality of using the human's superior speed and armor to approach the hill. Harnan set off at a cautious jog, mindful of his footing. Still, with strides more than double Xur's, they would reach the hill much faster this way. Xur felt the steady, deep heartbeat of the human carrying him and hoped it masked the anxious leaps of his own heart. The duo reached the backside of the hill, and Xur noticed deep footsteps placed near rocks and trees leading up the hill. This was the path Harnan had taken previously. Seeing no need to try a different route, Harnan commenced the climb once more, retracing his earlier steps. They got to the top of the hill, and Harnan lowered his shoulder for Xur to drop off. Now came the most daunting part, Xur mused, as they sat in silence atop the hill, awaiting the killer's emergence from below. Xur stood quietly, observing as much of the hill's face as he could when he noticed something he hadn't seen before. It was a small, orange fabric hanging listlessly on a stick protruding from the hill. Whatever it was, it certainly wasn't natural. "Harnan," he whispered as quietly as his beak would allow. Harnan looked over and Xur pointed at the fabric. Harnan's eyes followed Xur's, pointing and landed on the orange fabric, and Harnan nodded. "What is it?" "Windage flag. Of course, there's never any wind here. They probably would have put it closer to your colony if there was." "Is the killer there?" Xur asked, readying to pounce down the hill after them. "Maybe," Harnan replied, "but we can't be certain. The only thing we're sure of is that the shooter would be able to see that flag from where they shot from." Harnan appeared poised to continue speaking, but fell silent as the hill trembled ever so faintly. Xur barely had time to scratch beneath his beak when a voice behind him made him all but jump out of his feathers. "Don't move a muscle," the voice commanded. Xur stiffened instinctively and saw out of his peripheral vision that Harnan did the same. Ironically, Harnan had initially suspected this hill to be the shooting spot for the killer, but when they searched it earlier, they found no trace of the killer. It wasn't until after a visit to the human colony that the detectives had realized the killer had access to significant tunneling equipment and was likely firing from inside the hill. "Place your hands on your head, slowly. Interlock your fingers," the voice commanded again. It was slightly higher pitched than Harnan's, but deep enough to likely be human. "Pig, where's your weapon?" "Right hip holster," Harnan replied. "Is a pig a type of human?" Xur couldn't stop himself from asking. "Silence, bird brain," the killer demanded again, "and get your hands, wings, whatever. Get them on your head." Xur complied to the best of his ability, but his anatomy made it more difficult to keep his wings over his head, and he didn't have fingers to interlock. Xur heard the killer step forward, grumbling slightly as he also had to extract his feet from the soil. A pale human hand appeared in Xur's peripheral vision and fumbled around Harnan's waist before retreating with his weapon in hand. The metal danger end of his own weapon remained pointed at the back of Harnan's head. "You know, had you remained in town, I wouldn't have been able to apprehend you," the murderer mused. "Funny," Harnan muttered into the dirt. "I was going to say the same thing." Harnan loosed a short whistle, an ascending note that ended sharply and carried through the air. In the same moment he moved. Xur had seen Harnan move quickly several times now, but only now did he realize just how quickly the human could move. It was obvious now that Harnan had merely been moving lazily before. Harnan tucked his head as low to his chest as he could and rolled to his side, away from Xur. Taking the same cue, Xur tucked and rolled in the opposite direction. A sharp crack of thunder sounded, and a puff of dirt flew upward where Harnan's head had been but moments before. As he rolled, Xur pulled his phaser from its holster beneath his wing. Xur finished his maneuver, his phaser now armed and aimed at the human who had crept up on them. He pressed the firing button, and the phaser's computer beeped in acknowledgement. The weapon fired, but the energy it released was invisible to the naked eye. The impact on the human was nearly as imperceptible, the energy barely singeing the edge of its shirt before being largely absorbed by the resilient creature's skin. Krax bounded up the hill, heeding his partner's whistle, and closed the distance on the attacker. Harnon's four-legged, fur-covered pet would have easily ranked as an apex predator on any planet Xur had visited. The dog lunged at the attacker's forearm, even as the weapon in the attacker's hand unleashed another thunderous blast aimed at Harnon. The impact connected this time, making a deep thwump in the armor Harnon wore and pushing him back onto his rear end. The weapon was aimed at Harnon again, but Krax reached the shooter's arm before he could fire once more and began pulling him off balance. Harnon returned to his feet quickly, a testament either to human armor or their natural resilience, or both, Xur thought. He swatted away the longer weapon that the killer now swung at him and ducked beneath his own dog as the struggling attacker lifted the dog bodily and swept it in an arc. Krax only growled more ferociously, never losing his grip as streaks of red blood began to show along the killer's arm. Harnon continued his low motion until his shoulder met the lower torso of the other human, and his arm swung around to close behind it. His motion continued still further as he now straightened upward and inward into the attacker, lifting him off the ground before bearing down on him in a tremendous slam. Xur had recognized that the humans were physically stronger than him just by looking at them. They were nearly twice his size and likely somewhere around 5 or 6 times his weight. They were creatures of mass and muscle compared to his slim, feathered form. Still, the amount of sheer brutal power they could wield with just their bodies had gone beyond what Xur expected. The body slam executed by Harnon drove both humans and the still-attached dog into the hillside, creating a sort of crater from the impact. Krax was first to regain his footing, having been spared the force of the tackle, and immediately resumed wrenching and thrashing at the killer's arm, evoking cries of pain from the now prone assailant. Krax's efforts wrenched Harnon's weapon free from the killer's grasp, and it tumbled through the air to land outside the little crater. Inside, Harnon had maintained his hold on the other human's chest, and had also begun wrapping up his legs, attempting to subdue him through physical restraint. The killer did not respond well to the attempt. He managed to free a leg and began mercilessly kicking at any part of Harnon he could reach. His other hand dealt hammer blows onto the snout and head of Krax, who only growled harder. Xur was out of his element physically here. Any one of those blows the human landed was more than capable of causing him serious injury or even death. But Xur was not one to sit idly by. He rose from his prone position and returned his phaser to its holster before running to retrieve the human weapon that had been flung from the melee. The gun, as Harnon had called it, was clearly not designed for Xur's anatomy. Xur struggled with holding it as the humans did, and instead leaned back from it. He rested the bottom of the gun against his hip to hold the weight and used one wing to point the end down at the hole, careful not to point it directly at anyone in the hole yet. His other wing folded into the guard around the lever the human used to operate the weapon, and he felt it move incrementally. Mustering all the courage and authority his voice could carry, Xur plumed out his crest to its full display and called out to the humans in the crater. "Stop! You are under arrest for the murder of several members of the colonization board, as well as the assault of 2. He looked again at Krax. 3 officers of the law." The struggle in the pit persisted for a moment before the other human finally noticed the gun in Xur's wings. He stilled himself as commanded, though his arm was still shaken wildly by Krax, and he still gasped in pain and exertion. The attacker was young. Xur was not familiar enough with humans to say how mature it was exactly, but he could tell there was a significant difference between him and Harnon at least. And he was familiar. Even muddied and bloodied as he was, Xur recognized him from the mayor's office. The young man had been smiling there, in a picture on the wall. "Zerk, I'm Detective Xur, and I am hereby arresting you for the murder of several prominent colonists and the attempted murder of Detective Harnon." At a command from Harnon, Krax finally released Zerk's arm, which Harnon forced behind Zerk's back and secured there with metal bracelets linked together. The two struggled out of the crater together, leaving deep furrows in the softened ground as they clambered up. "What he said," Harnon said at length, still breathing heavily from the exertion. He winked down at Xur, and Xur passed him back his weapon, which Harnon examined quickly and reholstered. We got him, Xir. Khazir thoughtfully scratched beneath his beak as he completed the report in his notebook. It whooshed away with the synthetic sound of wing beats as he sent it to the chain of command that oversaw his precinct on this small planet. The evidence was more than sufficient to prove Zerk had committed the killings, and the case had been closed within 3 days. Zerk's weapon had been very similar to the one the human mayor had displayed on his wall, though new metal had been forged onto the firing mechanism to repair the damage it has sustained due to the human colony's import rules. It was chambered, as Khazir learned the term to be, in the correct size for the stingers recovered in and around the victims, and the cases that held them were revealed to have traces of the seismic crystals, substance native to the planet. The mining drill was recovered near the base of the hill, and seismic scans showed a somewhat collapsed tunnel leading away from the hill toward the human colony. The only thing that wasn't tidy in the case was Zerk's testimony. Though the prosecutors pressed Zerk to admit that the killings were motivated by the desire to force the colony away from the palladium deposit nearby, Zerk remained adamant that the killings were motivated internally for his own reasons. It was determined to be a twisted revenge attempt when the defense revealed that Zerk's mother died in the First Contact War. No charges were pressed against Zerk's father, the mayor, for possibly attempting to push the colony off the deposit, but the corporation that owned the colony wished to avoid spoiled relations with their planet-side neighbors and had him reassigned to a different colony. The relationship between the two colonies remained tense, but open hostilities never manifested. To broker an easy peace, the new mayor of the human colony, Dr. Rodriguez, launched a joint construction project, hoping to create a middle ground town between the colonies that could serve as a business and political meeting ground, as well as a recreational area for all species. The roads and floors must be paved, though, she had stipulated. All in all, a job well done, Xir thought to himself as he entered the human hospital. The receptionist stopped pretending to be busy as she saw him and smiled down at him. Mr. Harnan is nearly finished with his checkup. I'm sure he wouldn't mind your company in his room. It's the 5th one on the right. And she pointed through the double doors behind her right shoulder. Khazir nodded his thanks and soon found himself in Harnan's room. The nurse that had examined him had just left as Khazir walked in, and Harnan was still putting his shirt on. Large black and blue marks spread out from his stomach where the human stinger had impacted him. The marks seemed to bother Harnan, but only slightly, and he greeted Khazir enthusiastically. How are you, Khazir? Well, Harnan, yourself? Just about back to normal. Kind of embarrassing getting shot by your own gun, though. Something on your mind? Khazir noticed his wing scratching beneath his beak and lowered it slowly. I suppose there is. Maybe you could clear some things up for me?
You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.